Welcome to the first in our series of online learning tutorials on the science and practice of risk assessment in the criminal justice system, developed by the Urban Institute through the Risk Assessment Clearinghouse project. These tutorials are intended to assist criminal justice practitioners in their incorporation of risk assessment tools in their everyday decision making. This tutorial provides an overview of the concept of risk and how it is applied in criminal justice settings. The Risk Assessment Clearinghouse is supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, a component of the Office of Justice Programs in the United States Department of Justice. Points of view or opinions expressed in this document are those of the Urban Institute authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. In this first Risk Assessment Clearinghouse tutorial, we will introduce the concept of risk and what it means in the criminal justice context, discuss how risk is defined and used at different points in the criminal justice process, such as pretrial release or detention, or preparation for reentry from prison or jail, and provide a brief overview of how risk assessment instruments measure risk. Justice practitioners make decisions every day that have serious potential consequences for public safety and the life prospects of people who come into contact with the justice system. By making decisions based in part on considering what the likely future consequences can be, decision makers are thinking about risk. Risk in this context can be defined as the likelihood of reoffense or noncompliance with justice system requirements in the community. This includes outcomes such as defendants appearing in court or failing to do so, probationers complying with or violating their terms of supervision, or people returning from prison committing new offenses or remaining crime-free. The risk of bad outcomes is not the same for all people. It varies in populations in ways that we can measure. Basing justice decisions in part on risk can help us make fairer decisions that better support public safety and individual success. The specific risk being measured can vary by justice setting or stage in the justice process. For example, when considering whether a defendant should be detained or released at the pretrial stage, the relevant risk considerations are how likely the person is to appear in court and how likely they are to commit a crime while in the community pending conclusion of their case. By contrast, when engaging in decisions around release from incarceration or placement on community supervision, the relevant considerations are primarily reoffending in the community. Many risk assessment tools are developed and tested for specific types of justice decisions tied to different stages in the justice process. When selecting or using a risk assessment tool, it is important to be clear about what type of risk you are seeking to manage or reduce, and ensure that the tool that will inform your efforts is appropriate to measure that type of risk for the justice population you are working with. In addition to defining what we mean by risk in the justice context, it's important to distinguish between the concepts of risk and stakes. When we talk about risk in the context of risk assessment, it generally means how likely a bad outcome is to happen, but not necessarily how bad the outcome might be. By contrast, stakes refers to the severity of offense and how damaging it might be. Violent and sexual offending are the highest stakes types of offending because of the degree of harm they cause. Property crimes happen more frequently, but are generally considered much lower stakes. There are risk assessment tools that specifically measure the risk of high stakes offending, for example, for violent or sexual offending. Risk assessment tools are actuarial tools that predict the risk of outcomes such as reoffending. The term actuarial comes from the actuary profession, professionals who are employed by insurance companies and use statistical models to determine what premiums an insurance company should charge a customer based on the likelihood of outcomes, such as being in a car accident for auto insurance, or someone incurring large medical costs for health insurance. Actuaries use data from large populations of past insurance company customers to identify factors that are relevant predictors, such as age and past driving record in the case of auto insurance. Developing risk assessments in criminal justice operates from a similar principle, looking at data to determine what factors are related to the outcome of interest, how strong that relationship is, and combining them into a tool that synthesizes the risk factors into a risk score. These tools are good decision aids in part because they can systematically and consistently consider more factors than a single individual can. It's important to remember that risk scores produced by actuarial tools convey a probability, not a diagnosis. When insurance companies set a high auto insurance rate for someone, they don't know that the person will be in an accident. What they know is that people with similar risk factors have been more likely to get into accidents in the past. It's the same idea when using risk assessments to predict justice outcomes. Good risk assessment tools are built from an analysis of factors associated with negative outcomes in the past. These predictors will differ depending on the outcome being predicted. Many predictors are based on well-known risk dynamics. Age is often included in risk assessments due to the well-established fact that people are less likely to commit crimes as they get older. Risk predictors also tend to reflect the principle that past behavior is predictive of future behavior. A person who has failed to appear in court multiple times before is much more likely to fail to appear than someone who doesn't have that track record. A person who has violated conditions of probation supervision in the past is at greater risk of failure when placed on probation. It is important to understand what goes into developing a risk assessment, what it measures, and what it does not. To make a risk assessment, we examine data on populations to understand what characteristics are predictive. This is how we come up with a combination or mix of predictors that are later used in risk assessments. Risk assessments are then created. Then the tool is applied to a different set of people who share the same characteristics. Many factors can help create better risk assessments. For example, the more data, the better, and the more a past population is like the future population, the better. Here we have a concrete example showing the items that are in the Virginia Pretrial Risk Assessment Instrument, or VPRA, and the relationship to pretrial failure, the outcome the VPRA is designed to predict. This tool consists of 8 factors. One relates to the primary charge facing the defendant, with defendants facing a felony more likely to fail than those charged with a misdemeanor. Having charges pending at the time of arrest for the current charge is also a risk factor for failure to appear. Past criminal history or history of failure to appear are risk factors for failure to appear. Again, here we see the principle that past performance is predictive of future performance. And stability factors related to resident employment or caregiving are also related to the likelihood of pretrial failure, as is a history of drug abuse. Here we see how risk categories are defined for the VPRA and how defendants in each category did when released with pretrial supervision. VPRA scores place defendants in one of 5 risk categories: low, below average, average, above average, and high. For this analysis, Van Nostrand and Rose examined pretrial outcomes in terms of 3 distinct types of failure: failure to appear in court, a new arrest during time under pretrial supervision, and a technical violation of the terms of pretrial supervision. They also looked at the inverse, success under pretrial supervision, meaning the absence of any of these 3 kinds of misconduct. As intended, defendant performance was different across the categories, with defendants in each category performing a bit worse as the risk level ascends. However, it's worth noting that even in the high-risk category, more than 2/3 of defendants succeeded. It is valuable for practitioners using a risk assessment tool to have this type of data available, so they understand what outcomes are associated with each risk category. So in summary, risk assessments are used to gauge the likelihood of a variety of future adverse criminal justice outcomes occurring. These adverse outcomes can include things like rearrest, reconviction, or failure to appear in court. Risk assessment tools look and function somewhat differently at each decision point in the justice continuum. Risk and stakes are importantly different concepts. Risk deals with how likely a bad outcome is to happen, whereas stakes are about how damaging a bad outcome would be. Risk scores are translated into categories such as high risk and low risk, which are used to guide decision making.